Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Ewen MacAskill is so famous that he's been played in movies and on stage many times over the last few years on account of his central role on behalf of the Guardian newspaper in landing the big fish called Edward Snowden. But today I'm going to talk to him about an even bigger fish, at least as far as Britain is concerned, by the name of Sturgeon, Nicola Sturgeon. She succeeded Alex Salmond. But I better not take this watery metaphor any further.
Nicola Sturgeon's Scottish National Party now stand triumphant on the Scottish political stage, and their main goal is the end of Britain. They are already making waves at Westminster, where they are the third party in Parliament, dwarfing all the others.
Next year, they will seek a third term as government of Scotland's devolved Parliament, and few would bet against them achieving it, even with proportional representation. When I first met the now internationally famous Ewen MacAskill, he was a reporter on The Scotsman, and he still keeps a close eye on things Scottish and was in Scotland during the general election. He joins us now to discuss the question, Whither Caledonia? Whither? Ewen, is it ineluctably headed for the exit? Will Britain cease to exist as a state?
I think that's probably the case. I think we're much closer to that than we were a year ago, even in spite of the referendum result. The SNP seem to be in a win-win situation. They're sitting at Westminster. Anything that goes wrong, any cuts in welfare, they blame the Tory government in Westminster. Having a Tory government at Westminster is probably a better result for them than being in coalition with Labour. They can point to Scots and say, you stay part of the UK, this is what you get, a Tory government at Westminster. And one of the worst kind of Tory governments.
Elected in England, of course, because the Tories have only one MP in Scotland, but even more remarkably, much more remarkably, Labour has only one MP. Now, when we used to regularly talk at weekends just for a catch-up, when I was a Glasgow Member of Parliament, Labour was a colossus with 50 members of Parliament, and included in that 50 some of the biggest figures in British politics, Robin Cook, John Smith, Donald Dewar, and many others. Now it's been virtually wiped out, and I couldn't even name the fellow who hung on as the sole Labour Member of Parliament. What happened?
It's a really good question, and I don't think anyone has a very good answer. There's lots of different answers, but not one that's definitive. Maybe the SNP were good outflanking Labour. They managed to position themselves to the left of Labour in Scotland. And maybe Labour in Scotland has been too complacent for too long. They took, certainly the west of Scotland, for granted. A lot of people they put into the councils and into the Scottish Parliament were second and third rate candidates. They didn't seem to care. The kind of people you spoke about, Donald Dewar went back to serve in the Scottish Parliament, but maybe they needed some other big figures to go back and serve in the Scottish Parliament as well.
The second and third raters must themselves now run the risk of being wiped out next year because, of course, the Scottish Parliament is elected next year. Most of them are constituency MSPs. They can't really desert their constituencies, so they must stand and fight there. And there must be a real chance that they'll be knocked out too.
The likelihood is that the SNP are going to wipe the floor with them next year. It's hard to see a scenario that's going to change that.
That makes it a kind of one-party state then, doesn't it?
I mean, David Cameron's already said we're going to give them Scotland more powers. So they just take every concession that's going. You take a little more devolved power here, a little more devolved power there. And then you reach a stage where Scotland will wake up one morning and think, well, we're almost effectively independent. Okay, we might not have control over foreign policy or defence or immigration, but we've got just about everything else. So what's there to be scared of? Why not just go the whole hog?
Well, that logic seems very powerful to me. The question I then ask you is, do the SNP want it? Because, of course, there are other examples, the Catalan nationalists, for example, who don't actually really want to leave Spain. They want to get as many goodies and as many devolved powers as they can. They always kind of stop short of the final push.
Yeah.
Is the SNP in that bracket, or are they really going for it?
Well, there's two. The SNP is like most parties as factions. There's a faction that are totally committed to independence, and there's others that think if you can create a situation where you get devolved max, maybe that, you know, maximum powers short of foreign policy, defence and immigration, then most Scots would be satisfied with that. But I think it's much more likely they will push for independence. They will, I think that this kind of sort of creeping shift towards independence, you will see the polls maybe a year or two from now, maybe it'll be 55% in favour of yes. And at that stage, you could see them have another referendum and win it. I mean, I could see the Catalonia parallel as a good one, but I think the mood has changed in Scotland. What's interesting is there hasn't been a poll on independence since April. So although there's been this huge surge for the SNP, we haven't seen, no one's tested whether support for independence is done.
And winning, what is it, 97% of the seats or whatever is misleading too, isn't it? Because they only got 50% of the vote. Still a gigantic vote, but it doesn't mean they've actually got the support of 97% of the people. They'd need a proximate cause to go for another referendum, though, wouldn't they? What might that be?
Well, I think you know the answer, same as me. If Cameron has a referendum on Europe, then you know you could use that as an excuse, you know, to trigger a referendum in Scotland, saying, you know, the Scots are more pro-European. We don't want to leave Europe, so that would be an excuse. But one of the interesting things is that statistical surveys show the Scots like to pretend they're more pro-European, but the statistical survey shows that attitudes in Scotland are basically the same as in England. Still a lot of scepticism there. There's a lot of myths in Scotland. We like to pretend we're more left-wing than the rest of the country, but I'm not. Never been entirely persuaded by that.
Felt like that when I was there. You were just talking about that this morning, about the European Union.
Well, what their position would be, indeed, in case Cameron would succeed in, or not succeed, the referendum would result in an exit from the EU. Where would Scotland be left?
The SNP would say, look, we want to stay within the European Union. We most of what trade there is that Scotland has is with mainly with Europe, you know, apart from take whisky out of the equation. They'd then say we'll keep the we'll prepare to join the euro. So it would be a strange position where you have England with its pound and Scotland with the euro.
I mean, I know that Cameron doesn't want to leave the European Union, but once a referendum gets underway, he's no longer in control of that, and the press pumping out their Europhobia and so on. It could actually happen. And one of its obvious consequences is the point you were making to me this morning. That would be the excuse for Scotland to leave, and Scotland would be accepted into the European Union. Then you'd have a small island, one part of it in the European Union, and one part of it not. The same of course,
Ireland,
the same of course in Ireland, where one part is in and the other part would not. Britain as a state, I don't want to use the vernacular, but it's kind of looking burst.
If you'd asked me 2 years ago, I'd have said this stuff a fantasy, but it's not fantasy anymore.
But it's also a bit of a protest vote against Labour, I assume.
Yeah, it's you're exactly right. It's anti-Westminster. But it's in Scotland, the level of disillusionment and anger. I said this to Labour people, there's a real raw anger with the Labour Party in Scotland. And they were disputing this. They said, OK, people aren't very happy, but raw anger's a bit overstating it. But if you go on the doorsteps of Glasgow or Paisley or even parts of Edinburgh, as I did, then it's raw anger. I don't know why they've got this animus towards the Labour Party.
Well, the Blair years obviously have something to do with it, though probably not in the estates that you're talking about, but amongst, if you like, the political class in Scotland, there's a pretty overwhelming rejection of the Blair formula of war and neoliberal economics following George Bush, neocon foreign policy and so on. None of that even played at the time before it turned into the huge disaster it looks today. But there must be something more. It must be the spouse that was neglected and not beaten, but starved of any real reward for their loyalty over a long, long period. And suddenly it flips because Scotland voted Labour for the best part of 100 years. There was one exception in 1950 when the Tories were the majority party, but Labour was the overwhelming power in Scotland for all of my lifetime. So it must have something to do with that, awakening up and realising that actually we've given all this, but what have we got?
I know you know these figures as well as I do. Last year during the referendum, I spent a lot of the time in the East End of Glasgow. And you can say, things are better than when we were growing up. Then you look at it and you think, in a hell of a lot, it's not better. The gap between those with and those without is still huge. And the statistics for the East End of Glasgow are among the worst in Europe in terms of health and poverty. And so you're right. Labour's had huge number of terms in office and never really addressed. There's never been a crusade against the poverty of the west of Scotland.
No, and Scotland has an exit, which poor parts of England don't have. They can't leave England. Although wait for the Yorkshire independence movement. Ewen MacAskill, thanks very much indeed.
Coming up after the break, former cabinet member in David Cameron's government, hotfoot from the United States, where he's been trying to secure the release of the last British hostage in Guantanamo Bay, the Right Honourable Andrew Mitchell MP. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Sputnik. David Cameron now rules Britain in a majority Tory government, so we better find out what he intends. His former cabinet colleague, Andrew Mitchell, who joins us from a noble mission, as Gayatri just explained before the break, is a big Tory fish. And I'm glad to say he joins us now. Andrew, welcome to Sputnik. First of all, let's start because you're just off the plane. How did the mission to Washington to free Shaka Amar go?
Well, we were a pretty eclectic group. Jeremy Corbyn, who's, I think, fairly described as a left-wing firebrand, David Davis, from the right, former leadership contender, me and Andy Slaughter, the member for Hammersmith. And we had meetings both with the administration and with some very senior senators, including Senator McCain and Senator Feinstein. And our point was that this is the last British inmate in Guantanamo. He was cleared twice, once under President Bush, once under President Obama, for release more than 6 years ago. He has still not been released, whereas others have been released to third countries where the Americans have had to pay for them to go, in particular Uruguay and Kazakhstan. And the fact that he hadn't been released when the British Prime Minister had pressed in January for his release was a very serious matter. And if this is how America treats her oldest ally, who has stood foursquare behind her, spent our blood and treasure in at least 2 recent wars, then it's a very poor show. And we pressed very hard for his immediate release. I have no idea what's going to happen. I think we've pushed it up the agenda. I think the coverage in America, which was good, suggests that it will get a greater focus. But it's up to the American administration. The president can ensure it happens if he wishes, and if he doesn't feel that this is a priority which is suppressed by other domestic priorities. But I'm certain that we have advanced the date when Shaka Amar will be cleared for transfer back to the United Kingdom.
Well, more power to you and well done for trying. But I must tell you, none of that really computes with me, because President Obama doesn't want Guantanamo. He wants to close it. He's busily sending inmates around the world. His closest ally, in the form of the Prime Minister, no less, David Cameron, is asking for its resident back, and yet he can't get out. What could conceivably be the reason for that?
That is absolutely the point. And the fact that he has been asked by his closest ally, David Cameron, to bring forward this release, the fact that there's been a huge petition online in Britain, the fact that 4 very disparate members of Parliament have gone to America to represent the unanimous motion, which you will recall, from March the 17th of the House of Commons, that he should be cleared for transfer. The fact that America does not choose to enact that as rapidly as possible is a very significant thorn in the side of a relationship which is undoubtedly deteriorating. And this is an issue of importance between America and Britain. And every day that it is not resolved, I'm afraid, will weaken what is a very important relationship for Britain.
Okay, let me press you, if I may, just one more time on this. You and I both know how politics works. I can make a request of you and really mean it, or I can make a request of you because people have asked me to make that request of you, and there's almost a wink in my eye which tells you that I'm going through the motions here. Is that what David Cameron did, or does he really mean it?
David Cameron has made clear he really means it. The British ambassador in Washington, who was in the meeting, has told me personally that the position was very clear, that David Cameron meant it. All the indications, the briefing from the Foreign Office before we went, because, of course, George, that was the first question that we asked, makes it very clear that he means it. And the truth is that the President could ensure that he was released tomorrow, because the mechanism for doing so is for him to instruct his new Defence Secretary to sign the form that goes to Congress and triggers a 30-day notice to Congress, not debatable, they can't go back on it, at the end of which he would be released. So the President can do that. And the fact that he is choosing, perhaps for domestic political reasons, not to do so, and to place the request of his oldest ally beneath those domestic considerations, is a matter of, for me, who has been an admirer of America for many years, of deep disappointment.
And for me, bemusement. Now, you and David Davis, I hate to put this responsibility on your shoulders, but the people watching this will know what I mean. You and David Davis, and a few others, are all that stands between Britain and barbarism. You're the only Conservatives who realise that you can be a capitalist, you can believe in capitalism, but you can believe in liberty too. Indeed, some of you would theorise that capitalism is liberty. What we have now is a Tory majority government that on the security agenda, on the Human Rights Act, and on many other things, is sending a shiver running through the land as to what their intentions are. You going to save us?
Well, of course, I don't agree with that, George. And I would argue, indeed, that it is the re-election of a Conservative majority government which has saved Britain from appalling barbarism on a number of fronts. But on the issue of the liberty agenda, this is something which runs through both parties. I mean, the worst Prime Minister in living memory, I'm afraid, on these was Tony Blair, who tried to ram through the House of Commons 90 days detention without charge, which, in my view...
Internment by any other name.
In my view, that is a barbarism that is appalling. And I was not thrilled when the first secret trial, which of course has effectively collapsed, was launched on the 70th anniversary of D-Day. So, you know, there's a strand which runs through all political parties on this matter. Labour, I think, when they were, certainly under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, was very illiberal indeed. David Blunkett, a politician who I admire in many ways, was the most, I think, most illiberal Home Secretary we have had in modern times. And in the Conservative Party, there is a very strong view, which I am inclined to share, that trying to withdraw from the European Commission on Human Rights, Convention on Human Rights, tampering with the Bill of Rights, unless it is substantively better than what we have at the moment, is a mistake. So, I mean, there will be battles in this Parliament, significant battles. You've got people like, it's not just people like David Davis, who has a clear record on these matters, and a very good one. It's also people like Ken Clarke, the highly respected Dominic Grieve, who was the Attorney General before he was dismissed by David Cameron. You know, they are making the same point. And I think that this is an opportunity for the House of Commons to speak on an issue of great importance. The House of Commons, of course, spoke on Syria. That was, to me, I think it was the wrong decision, as a matter of fact, because I am a muscular humanitarian and I believe that barbarians who kill and murder innocent women and children should receive the full force of the international community's condemnation. But the Syria vote, which, as I say, I think was wrong, was nevertheless an example of Parliament asserting itself against the executive. And on some of these liberty issues, I fear that Parliament may have to do so again.
Now, David Cameron has a majority, but it's a small one. You had black hair when I first knew you. You were a whip on the Maastricht process, where John Major's government had a life of hell with a small majority because they were always prone to erupting rebellions. You're no longer a whip. Are you expecting David Cameron's position to be all-powerful? Or are you expecting inside the party, knowing that he's going before the end of this term, to be running free?
I think that the position on Europe and the referendum is very different from what happened over Maastricht, because there is a clear plan and there will be a renegotiation, and it won't be politicians in what used to be called smoke-filled rooms who make up their mind. It will be everyone in Britain who will have a vote in the referendum. So for me, the pressure points aren't there. What, of course, is very important is that when the referendum comes, Tories should be able to campaign freely for what they believe. And so I think any attempt to try and stop members of the Conservative Party having a completely free vote in that referendum would be a big mistake. And I'm sure that's a mistake that David Cameron won't make. But in general, I think the European policy now has a structure to it, and everyone can see what that roadmap is. And I think there's a very good chance that the Conservative Party will embrace that structure, and we will get a conclusion once the negotiation, the renegotiation of terms has been decided.
So you expect no split in the party over the referendum?
I don't. I mean, there will clearly be differences of view on the referendum when it comes, and people, I think, will take different views on what has been renegotiated. But I don't expect the awful period for my party, which George was referring to, when we were first in the House of Commons, to characterise what happens over the next 18 months, or maybe more, maybe less, actually.
Now, you were a gamekeeper. You were the head gamekeeper. Are you going to be a poacher in this Parliament, or are you going back inside the pale?
No, I shall do what I think is in the best interests of my constituents, but I am by instinct a gamekeeper. But where there are issues where I think the government's wrong, if there are such issues, which of course I hope there won't be, but if there are, then I shall seek to argue on behalf of my constituents. But I made it very clear to my constituents during this general election that I regarded issues of liberty, giving unnecessary powers to the state over our liberty, as very important. And I think it's something which the whole House of Commons should engage with, because the state is not some omnipresent, all-knowing, all-understanding God. It is made up of people like us, with our foibles and our prejudices and so forth. And giving the state power should be done very sparingly by Parliament, and maintaining our individual liberties, particularly in the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, which this year is extremely important.
Andrew Mitchell, Right Honourable, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Well, we asked the question, what have the Tories got in store for us in the next 5 years? To which Takes replies, Downton Abbey and Oliver Twist meets the Wolf of Wall Street. Not pleasant at all. Good one, though, yeah?
That's brilliant.
Very brilliantly put. We also asked, how left is the SNP? Actually, indeed. To which Ricardo Picasso says, corporate tax down, iniquitous health and education policies, close hospitals and schools, #regressive.
Well, it's a very interesting point, and Ewen MacAskill was touching on it, wasn't he? Actually, the SNP talks left and acts right. Their power that they've had now 2 terms, with a third one probably coming up, they haven't raised tax by a single penny. They are fighting to cut business tax. They have lost more than 100,000 further education college places.
It's almost Blairite.
Yes, in practice, but not in rhetoric.
Yes.
That's the point.
Well, that's all that we've got for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us on Twitter at RT_Sputnik, and on Facebook. You can like us on Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.